Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Aware, Relaxed, Connected podcast. Join me as we explore approaches and orientations towards cultivating the physical body, the internal landscapes, the mind, and our relationship with reality as a whole. I'm your host, Craig Mallet. All right, I'm finally doing the podcast I have spent many hours thinking about doing, and so I'm here recording the first episode, and I wanted to use this episode just to give a general overview as to what I'm about and what the podcast will be about. So I'll get into my history in a bit, but basically I teach and study, probably the other way around, study and teach methods of self-cultivation, let's say. Um, I have done a lot of different approaches to self-cultivation, and so these days I'm kind of breaking my practices up into, let's call them four big categories. We have physical practices, and most of what I've done in this space is informed by a little bit by the usual suspects, just strength and rehab stuff. But I also spent a great deal of time in the movement culture, the movement community, natural movement world, just exploring movement and physicality in general. And I had some pretty interesting mentors in this space, some of who I hope to get on the podcast at some point. But generally, this space is where we learn to use our bodies in a very obvious way, learning to jump, learning to coordinate, learning to balance, all of these basic physical things that we need to do in our life. And they can all be taken to whatever depth people want to take them to. But overall, I think it's a pretty good idea that, even if we're meditating and doing esoteric stuff, that we still have a physical component to any practice of self-cultivation. And I think it's really necessary in today's world to keep that up. Use it or lose it is the common phrase. And that's definitely true. Even if you have other good meditative practices, if you're not being physical, if you're not jumping around, if you're not climbing, if you're not lifting stuff and moving through a more complex environment than just like an office chair to flat sidewalks, to sit in a car, to home, to sit on a couch and rinse and repeat that. No amount of meditation, no amount of introspective practices are going to substitute for that. So, even people who are really good at things like Tai Chi and Qigong, I think still need to run around and jump around and should probably work to keep that alive. Or maybe they don't want to, but that's important for me, and it's something I'm going to pursue, and it's something I'm going to recommend to my students. Yeah, so there's a physical component. Then we have the internal pillar. The internal pillar is really about all things qigong, internal alchemy, all the diving of the mind into the body. Somatics, I guess, could live in this category. I really use a Taoist frame to approach this, and I have very particular ways that I do this, but there are other ways of doing it. But this way of exploring interoception, like how can we get the mind in the body, the conscious connecting with the unconscious, relating to the unconscious in a more than superficial way, in a much deeper way. And part of this is, for me at least, the exploration of release. When we have the conscious mind commanding the body, telling it to do stuff as we do in physical practices, go do a jump, go do a flip, go do a this, go do a that, perform better. You set up this command dynamic that's like the mind says do and the body does. The internal space for me is really about releasing that command and releasing the agency of the movements back to the unconscious, to actually get the attention plugged down and in deeply into the unconscious. And the attention in this sense acts like a fuel for the unconscious. So we're going to be exploring all sorts of topics related to that. Typically the practices associated would be like qigong, neidan, internal alchemy, um, Neigong is another term people use for these kind of practices. Good yoga would live in here, but most yoga isn't good. Most yoga is very, very superficial and lives in the physical realm from my perspective. So good yoga would live in here. And, there's some obscure branches of this stuff too when you get into Sufi practices and stuff like this, that maybe I'll find someone who's into those and get them along as well. Then I have another category, which is the practices of the mind. And this is really everything to do with studying the mental structures. So we're getting out of the physical body and into the thinking, the ideation, the imaginal space, especially how we can project our mind and shape our mind to do certain things. Of course, when you're talking internal training, this is not the way you want to do it. Playing with the imaginal structures is like the opposite direction to what you want to go to internal training. But I think it's nevertheless a useful skill to have, a useful um, balancing agent for one, and a useful way of learning to relate to the mind in a bit of a healthier way, because most people have a pretty dud relationship with their mind. It's either way out of control or they think it's the worst and they want to get away from it. So learning actually how to interact with the mind, learning how the mind can be quite, like, especially the imaginal structures, can be a quite interesting tool to relate to the world, in particular the animate vision of the world, where we kind of consider the world to be alive. You have people who like talk to their cars as if they're alive, right? This is the animate vision of the world, and we can use imaginal structures to actually help aid these relationships in a really interesting way. So I quite like the mind for those purposes, and I use that function of the mind quite a lot in my day-to-day life. Particularly with distance healing, which I'll talk about a bit, I'm sure, in one of the podcasts. But, as a very kind of a little bit too rational, a little bit too skeptical a person, having a frame around this stuff really helped me to interact with it without going off into a crazy fantasy land. So just understanding actually how these structures worked, how they relate to reality, but how they're different from the reality they're relating to, and so on and so forth. So the exploration of the mind, thinking, and here you start to see the trickster and the resistance as well. The commentator, the ideas really resist certain practices, especially practices that are going to dethrone it. So it's interesting to study how that works, how we can get apparently tired during certain practices, how the commentator will show up and be like, "Oh, you're an idiot. You're doing this wrong. You don't need to do this practice. You should probably be doing something else." Or, "You're so good at this already that you need to be like not doing this and doing something else." These kind of comments that are there to stop us like going into places that may uproot the mind. So really looking at that and how it works. It's the practices for the mind for me are really about functionality. How can we use or understand the way the mind moves and works and get in a better relationship with that so it's not so crazy. So these are like the three big pillars: the physical pillar, all physical training; the internal pillar, which is like all the qigong, neigong stuff, yoga, maybe good yoga, not bad yoga; and the mental pillar, where it's all the study of the mind. Wrapping all of this, and what I would call the heart of my practice, is studying the context in which all this development happens. And for me, I really like the non-dual approach. I'm primarily influenced by two people in this particular realm, and that would be Adyashanti, who I think is just a phenomenal teacher of these non-dual practices, and he actually uses dualism within non-dual to make it work, which I really like. And the other one is David Haim Smith, who's a non-dual Kabbalist, who I just love his work, and it's really had a big impact on me. Yeah, so that's like the context within which the other three realms are kind of growing and developing. Then, of course, frames are only so good at framing things, and you've got all the other stuff like lifestyle, habits, waking up, going to bed, nutrition, this kind of thing. And I'm sure we'll get to discussing that at some point in the podcast too. And depending on the guest and who comes on board and who wants to chit chat with me, I'm pretty sure we can get some pretty interesting discussions going on that. And I'll also share my viewpoints on that at some point or another. So that's the basic like angle that I'm going for, the topics that I want to explore in this podcast. And I'm kind of aiming to alternate with no particular plan between me just riffing on a particular topic, and maybe just getting my ideas out there to share for anyone who wants to take them, and then bringing on really interesting guests because I've met so many unreasonably like hardworking and talented people who are really kind of like me, a little bit obsessive with these topics and going really deep in their own way. And I really want to bring them all on to get their angles on things, and just to get their names out there too. And connect up with connect me with them and my communities with their communities, and see what comes of it. Overall, my approach these days is really, I was really heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell, and I quite remember the night I was in Sydney at my friend Stu's place, and we threw on The Power of the Myth. And one of the first things, Bill Moyer, I think, is the guy who's interviewing Joseph Campbell in The Power of the Myth. And we had the video. We weren't there. You can get a book of it too, which is like the transcript. But the video is really great because you see Joseph Campbell, and all he's like really passionate about his mythology. And I think it was like one of the first questions the guy asked is like, why mythology? Why should I care? What's it got to do with me? And Joseph Campbell's answer just stuck with me. He said, the first thing I would say is, you don't need this. You've got a good life. Go live that life. You can do without it. And that he doesn't believe in people engaging with a topic because it's said to be important. Rather that some people get caught by a topic, and if you give me some time to introduce a topic, maybe you'll get caught by it too. And I really took this to heart, and this has been the underlying kind of driver for why I share stuff. It's not because I believe this is the right way, the only way, the best way. I've met so many people that have just shown to me that there's always a better method. There's always, someone with some sort of method or approach or teaching that can work better or faster or more effectively or whatever. It's not really about that, for me. Uh, it's about connecting and exploring and actually being on the edge of the mystery of the discovery each day, where finding something new, getting in a better relationship, going deeper with something. It's about being on the precipice of the unfolding mystery. And so, of course, I can't know that there's not a better method out there. Almost certainly in most of the topics I teach, I can point to people who are more skilled at the techniques than I am. And I can also find people who are probably better teachers than me too. But I'm not sharing to be the best. I'm sharing because it's just my angle, and my particular mix is very interesting. I don't think anyone out there is doing quite the same mix that I'm doing with quite the same background informing it. And so this, I feel, might be interesting to other people. Certainly, I've got some students who really like it, and if you like it too, then that's really great. And if you're caught by the topics that I'm sharing, then yeah, I hope you tune in more, and I hope you find something useful and can take that and apply it to your life. The main thing I'm really interested in is like, how does this stuff affect our day-to-day life? How does it affect us when we're, walking down to the shops, talking to friends, doing life, doing our job or socializing or whatever it happens to be, hanging out in nature or hanging out in a city. How do these practices help me relate to those moments better and help me navigate those moments, um, maybe in a more harmonized way? And so this is what I'm really interested in. I'm not so interested in going really deep in any of these skills in the sense of performance wise. Like I said, like if you want to get good at performance, you've just got to push limits and train like a maniac, and that's all possible if that's your thing. But it's not really my thing. My thing is more of a kind of, yeah, a relational thing than a performance thing. So hopefully all of that made a bit of sense, and you're starting to get um, a vague idea, at least if you haven't been into my material before, as to what I'm about. physical training, internal training, mental training, and a kind of non-dual framing of the whole process and making it mostly relational. Then I guess the next part is to just give you a brief summary of my history so you kind of have a basic idea of what's informing what I'm doing. Yeah, so let's start with that, and maybe that will round out the introductory episode, and then we can get on to the nitty-gritty of the details. So I started training in 2003, and my training was really traditional in the sense of I met this teacher. He was a Chinese teacher, and he taught this really traditional art. For those who are listening and know these terms, the arts were Xinyi Liu He Chuan and Cha Chuan. These are like Muslim Chinese martial arts, and he was super, super traditional. He would just say, here's a movement, copy it, and wouldn't share too many details until you'd really put your heart and soul into doing your very best to copy it. And then he would lecture on like Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and we had this really nice balance between Cha Chuan, which is a really athletic kind of long fist style of Chinese martial arts, much closer to the modern wushu kind of arts that you see. And Xinyi Luohe, which is a very strange looking art for anyone who hasn't seen it. There's like all this marching up and down the hall with bizarre movements of the hands, and you just repeat these exercises over and over and over again, like rooster walking, um, mm, bare arms, dragon spine, stuff like this. Really kind of animalistic based and single movements that you just march and repeat and march and repeat. So I did that with that teacher, and he really wasn't into teaching the martial side of things. So we didn't really do partner drills at all that much. Every now and again, we would do some conditioning or something like that. But it was really about going deeply into these motions in a kind of repetitive, almost like a trance like practice. I think practice was usually like 3 hours or something 3 times a week. And in between, I was meeting with the guys from the class, and we were like meeting in the morning and training, and in the evening and training. And usually I was training sort of 5 to 6 days a week for about 9 years, 9 or 10 years I was doing this. But I am like an exceptionally tight person, flexibility wise. And all of this training, it helped a bit, but I was having some problems with my knee. I was having some tension problems. And so towards the end of that 9 year period, I got in contact with um, a guy named Kit Lachlan, who very quickly became a good friend of mine, and I could quite remember our meeting very fondly. Yeah, met Kit Lachlan, found out he lived like 3 blocks away from me, went around to his house. I think we were just drinking tea and nerding out about all sorts of things for a few hours, and we kind of immediately hit it off. And I ended up learning a whole lot from Kit about flexibility training, particularly from his system called stretch therapy. So I did that for many, many years, working with Kit. And then later working with one of Kit's proteges, Dave Wardman, which was super interesting. That I didn't realize how much that had impacted me actually. That's the messages Kit taught about in flexibility, like going to that edge of where you are familiar and releasing and softening over that edge into the void. A lot of that stuff really influences the way I do things today, and it's been incredible how much of an impact it's had, even though I'm not doing the same shapes, right? I'm not really training that stuff these days, but those essences are still there. So I did a bunch of stuff with Kit, and at the same time, I was getting into all the gymnastics bodies. At the time, gymnastics bodies had an online forum. I was learning all the calisthenics stuff, and this was like before there were 15,000 YouTube tutorials on how to do it. No one really knew how to do a planche, and this is like 2008 or 9. Um, Most people were like unsure if a planche was even possible for the normal person. Muscle ups were a really rare skill at that point in time, and same with handstands and things like that. It wasn't as big as it is today, um, nor did we have access to the ideas behind how to train it. So I really dove into that realm for a little while, doing the body weight strength training, calisthenics, alongside the flexibility. And I think it was around 2011 or 12 the martial arts teacher closed the school, and so I was kind of like set free into the world. And already I was dabbling in a lot of this stuff, and I ended up getting a personal trainer certificate, which was garbage. I've never used it ever since then. I think I spent 6 months working in a gym to just hated every moment of it, and it was just not my people and not my place. But I was doing a lot of natural movement work. I worked for MoveNet, the company, for a little while. I was working a lot with Simon Thacker doing he was doing ancestral movement, and we like launched these retreats together. He's doing it a lot now. It's like a bush retreat. But I launched that with him, and we had this like real idea to be, being capable of moving through nature and moving with nature, and using our understanding of our own movement to connect us to the animals, the trees, the things like that, in a really really nice way, really organic way. So lots of throwing stones and just like climbing trees and lots of awkward strength, awkward movements, not the typical like squat deadlift kind of thing you get at a gym. We were carrying odd shaped logs and wrestling with each other and all of this kind of stuff. And so had a few years of doing that and just generally exploring. And then in 2014, I met a Taoist teacher, and I stayed in that school until 2003 and ended up working out. I mean, I studied a lot in that school and ended up deciding that being in the school really wasn't for me. It wasn't, my values weren't matching the teachers. The way I was starting to explore was kind of not aligning with the way the school wanted to do things, and so on and so forth. So I parted ways in at the end of 2023, which is reasonably recent. It's only a year and a bit ago, and so I've spent the last year really consolidating what it is that I'm interested in and what I want to get, um, what I want to do with my life and how I want to train and what I want to explore. And that's where this podcast has been born. And I'm hoping with the podcast not only to connect with a bunch of really interesting people and share my ideas, but really I'm always on the lookout for clues, just hearing the way people approach things. Often these like little clues slip into my practice, and like the stuff with Kit, even though I don't do it their way, that kind of clue kind of melts into the way I do things and really informs it. And so part of the reason for the podcast is this kind of selfish desire to be able to talk to a bunch of cool people and get some clues. And then I hope that kind of radiates out from the podcast to the people listening, that you too can get clues and have that inform your own practice, and maybe take it in a direction you didn't expect, an adventure into the wilderness. So where I'm at now is I don't have a formal teacher, and I'm really just trekking off into the unknown, kind of on purpose. Like I said, I'm interested in this relationship with the unfolding mystery, and my practice is really reflecting that at the moment. I have no guarantees of where I'm going, um, what the outcomes might be. It's kind of unique mix of stuff that I'm doing, so I can't really say, yeah, it'll definitely, cause X, Y, and Z. But I am doing that exploration informed by a lot of training, and so it's not just like a brainless, like off into the wilderness I go. There's particular essences I'm looking for, particular qualities, and I'm really studying how to bring these qualities to life and what brings them to life, and not doing my best not to leave any stone unturned with that. So to get to a really raw way of delivering these qualities, um, that can be easily assimilated or understood by people beginning this stuff. And that's one thing I wanted to get to. So many of these arts are just shrouded by this air of mystery, and there's value to that, for sure. And there's value in having to do the long, slow trudge where you don't know where it's heading. At the same time, with just a couple of orienting concepts and things to look for and things to look out for, it can really save a lot of crashing and burning. Let's call it unnecessary dead ends, right? I think we all need to go down dead ends and work out for ourselves why things don't work. But there is a bunch of stuff that I've learned that is like, that could have saved me a whole bunch of time and trouble if someone just mentioned that like 20 years ago for me. So I'm hoping to share some things like that with you, the listeners, and yeah, hopefully something comes of this. I'm just, as I do with everything, I'm not really a kind of sit down and plan, this is episode 1, this is episode 2, whatever kind of person. I just sit down, hit record, and see what comes out. And that's how I teach my classes and how I teach my workshops too. There's very little planning that goes into it, because I hope to infuse it with what I actually know about instead of having to like memorize a script of something I don't really know about. I want to only talk about things I really deeply know. And if I deeply know them, I should just be able to talk off the cuff about the topic in clear detail. Um, so I'm going to keep the podcast reasonably informal like that. I'm going to keep it hopefully more conversational, more like just a couple of friends chit chatting over coffee about stuff we're nerds about, right? We're just gonna sit here and nerd out on a podcast about this stuff, and hopefully you find it interesting, or hopefully it captures you somehow. Um, and hopefully we get into some really interesting topics, physical topics, internal training topics. I'm going to try and bring on some of my buddies who do internal training. I'll definitely bring on a stack of cool people from the movement world that I know. Um, and also bring on some strange animist kind of folks who are doing weird stuff and esoteric stuff, but in a really grounded, not new agey way, like a grounded down to earth way. And yeah, we'll see who we can get on and who wants to have a chat and where it goes. So launching this podcast out into the mystery, and hopefully it kind of follows the tone of my training where it's unfolding, and with any luck, it's surprising me as much as it is surprising you, the listener, and helping. That was a bit of a word spew for the first episode, but let's see what it sounds like when I listen back to it. And if you at all have any questions about any of the stuff I've mentioned in the podcast, or, in future episodes, just write me an email. My contact details are all over my website. And I'm sure will be part of the podcast and everything, in the show notes. So write me a message, share with me what your practice is like, how it's similar, how it's different, what things have helped you regarding the topics we talk about. And I really look forward to hearing you, and I'm really looking forward to recording more of these. So this is the first one, and I guess we'll call that the end and sign off. Thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening or morning or whenever you're listening to this, and I look forward to seeing you or talking to you on the next episode.